Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 16th chapter in the book of Proverbs. We made it all the way up until the 16th verse. We're going to cover verses 17 through 33, so we're going to cover slightly more today than we did that day. One verse, and the reason I so divided it as explained on the original one is because verse 17 and 18 makes sense when you read them in tandem and read them after together. We'll get there when we get there, but the first thing we want to do is give our review, and not as an extensive as the actual lesson itself. We like to give lessons before lessons, which establish the context, narrative context of what we're reading. And there's 7 verses I want to read out of the 16 which come before them, and the reason there's the first 4 and also verses 14 through 13 through 15, and the reason is because one of the things we've been repeating over and over since we've been doing them is beginning in the 10th chapter. Proverbs takes a distinctly non-literary turn. So in other words, whereas the 9 which come precede him has narrative qualities and characteristics without being strictly speaking narratives, but they do have they seem to operate according to a plot line with a definite beginning and an end, whereas those, you read a mixed and scattered multitude beginning in the 10th chapter. So they seem almost arranged at random, but occasionally you do get slews of verses which speak of the same thing, and that's what we have in the first 4 verses. So what I want to establish is the human submission to divine sovereignty is the theme of these 4 verses. To man belongs the preparations of the heart, but from Yahweh is the answer of the tongue. So we are heart creatures, man. We like to think with our hearts, and we don't think with our brains, but those who do, who exercise loving Yahweh with all thy might, mind, and strength, will have the be in tune with his mind, and they will have the answer on the tongue in any given situation. All the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but Yahweh weighs the spirits. So there's a dichotomy between our own sense of self-righteousness, which is where we are the ones who measure and evaluate our own righteousness, but there's divine criteria. He can see everything we've swept under the rug, everything we've conditioned ourselves, every sin we've conditioned ourselves to just forget about, pretend never happened, our innermost buried sins. He can see, he has subterranean insight into the human spirit and human heart. These are internal organs, and that is his measure for criterion. So to connect it to the sovereignty and submission, we better be submissive if we want to be rewarded by the sovereign one in the afterlife. Commit your works to Yahweh, and your plan shall be established. Now, the common error in this respect would be when one asks Yahweh to bless their plans after going through with him without consulting him in the first place. So the order and the priority are logically foundational in that we got to consult him before we go with our own plans and designs. If we want our plans to be established, to flourish and survive, that's what we got to do. We got to commit them to Yahweh from the womb to the tomb. So unless we have his explicit approval that this is what he in fact wants us to do, we should not move forward. But it's human nature to wander as sheep. Yahweh has made all for his purpose, and also the wicked for the day of evil. Now, one of the most perplexing questions that we can encounter in our apologetic efforts to atheists and non-believers is the existence of wicked in the world. Why would a good, loving God allow that? And the best answer I can think of, I have to give credit where it is due, it is in the Case for Faith, written by Lee Strobel. he wrote a series of books, The Case for Christ, and he's a well-known and famous author. But in The Case for Faith, I remember that either he or the one he was interviewing likened comparing that to criticizing the author of a novel before reaching the plot, the end of the plot. So we have to see this thing from the wide perspective, beginning to end, in order for it to all make sense here. And then verses 13, righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him who speaks what is straight. So we have to remember that Solomon was writing from a royal perspective. He was a king. That was his job. That was his life. That was his identity. And so he wrote from the top to the bottom, and his wisdom has trickled down through the ages. But he's just saying, he prefers righteous, honest talk. I guess that would be righteous lips. They would be the determining factor for that would be honest talk. Would be a source of delight and pleasure. And, why wouldn't an honest man not love or delight in another honest man? Now, there is another end of the spectrum of which he comments on in the next verse. The king's wrath is a messenger of death, but a wise man appeases it. Kings, just like any other humans, are prone to mood swings, but it is especially dangerous for an absolute monarch who has the power of life and death over every citizen. So they could declare a man executed at will. That was how concentrated power was in the ordinary authority in the ancient world. Israel was distinct in that they had a law that even their kings, the Mosaic law, that even the kings were bound by. But in the light of a king's face is life, and delight is like cloud of the latter rains. So he compares the grace and favor that he bestows on people by giving his very presence. He considers himself a life-giving source, or at the very least he could claim he added meaning to life, and Solomon struggled to find out the meaning of life. That is the nature of his chronologically latest book, Ecclesiastes, and that's another story we're going to get with the 17th verse. But before we do that, we want to point out something distinctive. Now, in the majority of the previous Proverbs, of which you read and explained when we did them, is that they follow an antithetical juxtaposition is the common formula. So it opposes one opposite or outlook and an opposite outcome, or either or both. And the way we can usually tell that is by the word but there are also, when we read the word and, that indicates that the second Proverbs, they're arranged in two distinct literary devices, and it's either completing the sentence or contrasting it. In this one, the only antithetical ones we read are the 22nd and the 25th, and we'll touch on them when we get there. Verse 17, the highway of the straight is to turn away from evil, and he who guards his life watches over his way. So those who walk the straight and narrow, they're not going to turn to the evil, which is literally all around them, surrounding them on every side of the road, enticing them and alluring them to get off the straight and narrow path of salvation onto the broad road of destruction. But if you guard your life, you're going to watch over your walk and your way, and you're going to consult Yahweh in prayer to make sure that you are doing his bidding and enacting his will with his blessings. And it's presumptuous to ask for blessings without having met the necessary pre-qualifying factors and conditions. Before destruction, pride, and before a fall, a haughty spirit, arrogant spirit. So this is one of the quotable ones. Nearly many Christians, it's impossible to say most, but many Christians know this verse by heart, but fail to heed it. And it is challenged because none of us are immune to pride or arrogancy. That I feel is the better word, a translated word, than howdy as it reads here. But it means essentially the same thing. It's just more relatable to our English language. But destruction is always preceded by pride. This was true in Lucifer's original rebellion. It was the sin of pride which compelled him to launch after what belonged to God, to claim what he wanted to change one word in the Lord's Prayer, mine instead of thine. He wanted the kingdom, the glory, et al., etc., for himself, and it was pride that motivated him to be discontent with his number two position as the supreme created being. And human pride is always preceded. This is as true in the history of empires. There's many. Pride has been the ruin of just about every one of America's predecessors, but I think our personal problem is lack of pride, at least in our country. That's what and pride of that nature isn't sinful, and we don't have time to get into all the semantics behind it. But so there are two things expressed that are parallel here before the cause and effect. So pride is the cause which affects destruction, and arrogance is the attitude that precipitates a fall, from which there is implicitly difficulty, if not impossibility, to get up from. Better to be lowly in spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. So Solomon was cognizant, at least, he had an abstract awareness of how how his inferior subjects lived and what went on and defined their daily routines. This is expressed both in the book of Proverbs and in Ecclesiastes. But he would rather have company than with meek people, humble people, those who are meek but mocked in the world, and poor and ridiculed and despised and neglected by good, polite society, than to divide the spoil with the proud, which the aristocratic class would have been especially prone to. So he preferred clearly preferred one to the other, shall we say. He who acts wisely concerning the word finds good, and blessed is he who trusts in Yahweh. So the first thing we read of is the word, and the word is not limited to the scripture alone, but we think that's the most necessary of its applications or possible outcomes. So the word is referred to as what we read from Genesis to Revelation, and there are power in words, and Proverbs speaks much of this, especially in the 15th chapter. But there is a power beyond description in this word. If you quote it, the devil and his human or demonic minions will flee. I have sent many atheist, evolutionist, Marxist, et al., etc., out of the room simply by quoting scripture. So there's a power in that word. And the second thing we want to, before which no devil or demon may withstand or survive, and then the trust in Yahweh, and this brings us back to verse 3-5. That's another easily quotable one, and that it's a good practice to be in the practice of memorizing scriptures. That way you'll have a word for the hour of temptation and devil in either his demonic or human components. But verse 3-5, trust in your, lean not on your own understanding, but trust in Yahweh with all thine heart. I'm probably getting it wrong, but I understand the principle to it. So trust is central. Trust indicates faith, and we trust him because he is faithful, and we have to exercise what limited faith we have comparably into him who is completely and totally faithful, in order to have a victorious, faith-filled life, both here and after. So trust in Yahweh has earthly and eternal consequences and causes and effects. The wise-hearted is called discerning, and sweetness of the lips increased learnings. So the first statement is more self-evident and less need of elaborate explanation. As one of the symptoms or signs of having a wise heart is to have the quality of discernment, which differentiates. It's a healthy judge that indicates what is good and what is bad, and that is its most wise applicant. One can be discerning in all items of information or fields of knowledge, but that's the most wise discernment, to detect good from evil and evil from good. Sweetness of the lips increases learning. So I don't know. A lot of people have memories, horror stories of their elementary school all the way up to high school, of teachers who used to berate them and just treat them in a way that was not conducive to instilling positive growth or optimism or enthusiasm for learning, because they were so mean. But if you teach nice, there's no reason to shout when you're really teaching someone, and such a person will be teachable because he is not a drama queen. He is not distracted by commotion and unnecessary gossip and anything else that is in a destructive direction. Understanding is a fountain of life, but to him who has it. But the disciplining of fools is folly. So there's that antithetical. The dead giveaway was the word but. So what happens after we read, everything we've read before has been and. So and sweetness of the lips before that. And blessed is he. And before that, you can reread them. And you should have a Bible in hand while you're watching these things. It's not enough just to watch me. You want to have your eyes on the Bible and all that stuff. But the more to the point of the actual contrast is that understanding is a source of life. It is a wellspring of life. When we speak of the word fountain, we speak of something which has enriching potential beyond its immediate area. And so that is a fountain of life. It gives life to those who have it. It gives life to those who spread it. It gives life to those who share it. So the motive and incentive for teaching is not to show how knowledgeable you are, but to increase the knowledge of the student. And but there's no sense in disciplining fools. A fool automatically and unconditionally, because of their very foolish nature and character, rejects. There is redemptive and educative value in discipline for the righteous, but the wicked are automatically going to resist being disciplined at all. That's one of the signs of folly, and we don't really have enough time to get in it, but we've read plenty on folly and foolishness. The heart of the wise gives discretion to the mouth, and he increases learning to his lips. So there's a connection between the heart and the lips. Now, in the ancients, they would have thought that the heart was the center of intellectual activity, whereas they had no notion that it was the brain. But, the language was sufficient to communicate to its immediate audience, and we'd be wise not to get caught up in their limitation of their knowledge or say that this is false or less than errant in any way, shape, or form. But from the heart, the meditations of the heart is connected to the mouth and lips. These are both organs, so an internal element controls what we exude externally, verbally. Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. So the pleasant words, and in the 15th chapter somewhere he says to speak a man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and how good is a word in its season. So that's the type of word he is describing here, and that would be comparable and sweet. And sweetness of that it instills in the mind and the heart and the spirit would be comparable physically to honeycomb. And it has the soul which it feeds. Our soul has appetites and capacities which must be fed, the same as our bodies. It is received and digested as a source of sweetness to it. And it also has a healing quality, so words can amend ruined relationships and relationships that have really gone awry, but there's no point beyond redemption, theoretically at least. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So we've read this before and recently in chapter 14, verse 12. We don't want to outright skip out on commenting just because we're getting caught aware of the time limitation. So we'll give our thing now. The human heart, humans' independent thinking apart from God is worthless and unreliable. You will be convinced you are right, but you will be under the spell and influence and power of the author of deception. There's no neutrality between good and evil. You're either on one side or the other. And if you want to, the way to life by opposite inference is the way that is right to Yahweh. So you want to align your wills, pray for guidance and direction before you go with anything, and then be continually grateful as after he blesses the plan you put in motion after beginning it, that he is allowing you to sustain and it has his blessing, and be sure to thank him en route and especially at the end. He who labors for himself, for his mouth drives him on. So, this doesn't necessarily apply to a family man who labors to feed his family, but perhaps a single male, since they would have been the only laborers then. The incentive and motivating factor and prompt and inner urge was his stomach. That's what makes a man work. When he has a choice between eating or starving to death, he's going to do the work and choose eating rather than begging on the street. A man of Belial plots evil, and on his lips it is like a burning fire. So Belial is a term indicative of Satan, and it's also connected to the deity Baal, but it had a broader reference at this time, at least by the New Testament. It had a broader reference to anything satanic. But even for the sake of Baal, as understood in the Old Testament, a Belial, first off, would have been a practitioner of their religion, the worship of Baal, which was one of the distinct deities, and we don't have time to get into the specifics of it, but on the lips, it is like a burning fire. So on their lips are destructive words that indicate the fire which awaits them, because they are tools of Satan and headed in the same direction. Satan always betrays his own. A perverse man sends forth strife, and a slanderer separates intimate friends. So it's a sign and signal of perversity to provoke unnecessary drama or conflict or anything else. And a slanderer is one who makes libelous claims with malicious intent against a rival or an enemy and starts this rumor-mongering campaign, which, if effective, will tear friends apart. It's really, this ties into the next verse. A malicious man entices his neighbor and leads him in a way that is not good. So as neighbors, we share the same habitat, we share the same neighborhood, we share homes close enough, and we exist to not lead them astray, but to obviously lead them in the right direction, because there's a communal element. There is more to life itself than the one to whom that life belongs. He has to coexist and co-inhabit. We are not uniquely alone creatures. We all exist in a planet filled top to bottom with life. And we have to interact with them in a way that is positive and beneficial. Winking with the eyes to plot perversity, moving his lips, he shall bring about evil. So this just describes the process through which, winking with the eyes, it's a charming move that several sophisticated con artists are actually quite adept at, winking with their eye in a way that deceives or just misleads or indicates that he's signaling that's something that's not quite good. And he's a motor mouth, and because his lips and mouth and tongue are flames of fire, he's going to bring about evil not only to himself in the long run, but ultimately immediately to his neighbor and the one with whom he interacts. Gray hair is a crown of adorning. It is found on the way of righteousness. Now, this is far too simplistic to interpret as a promise. What Proverbs often communicates is not promises, but principles. So it is, and remember, he's writing under the covenant, the old covenant, which was different than our covenant. It was a systems of rewards and punishment, and so there was blessings and longevity of life to those who walked the covenant path, and Solomon ultimately prematurely forfeited his life. He could have lived forever had he continued in the steps of his father David, but he was led astray by his foreign queens whom he loved and allowed them to allow himself to succumb to their idolatry. But we know that the good die young is a more than a slogan in the way I'm trying to connect it here, but something found in the way of righteousness. He who is patient is better than the mighty, and he who rules over his spirit than he who takes a city. Now, for the sake of comparison, I'm somewhat familiar with the Buddhist religion and tradition. I cannot speak on it authoritatively, but I do know that one of the paraphrased quotations that is attributed and accredited to the Buddha himself is that the mightiest of man is he who can control his own desires. He is mightier than any conqueror on the earth. Terrible paraphrase, but the concept communicating is that true strength drives it not in taming others, but in taming yourself, not in controlling others, but having self-control. And strictly speaking, there is no such things. And a lot of Bible teachers I've had who've seen any of the fruits of the Spirit listed in Galatians 5 will tell you to throw that thing out if it has self-control written where temperance is perhaps a better word, because there's no such thing as self in the Christian's life. We are reliant on the namesake we call ourselves after. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision by it is from Yahweh. So this is one of the gray issues of biblical. The scriptures never outright endorse the practice of determining decisions by laps. This was a common and customary practice among their pagan neighbors to take casting the lots and seeing which one moves and which one emerges in a certain way would have been to them a clear sign from some divine power they could not understand and did not exist. But we often witness that Yahweh does use it to accomplish his purposes. So when Jonah, his wayward prophet who rejected his commission and tried to flee away on the Mediterranean, was sleeping in the boat, his Gentile pagan neighbors cast lots and it fell on Jonah, and he explained, "I am who this storm is sent for." And we also find in the New Testament the apostles casting lots to select Judas's apostolic successor. It landed on Matthias, who does not, who is not mentioned henceforth in the Bible, but in Christian history and legend, he is a martyr and a stalwart of the faith, but it's really Paul who becomes Judas's replacement. But that's taking us far away from where we are right now. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for sticking with it. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Till next time. Bye-bye.